Hello everyone, welcome to another knowledge lesson. Before we start our lesson today, we're going to talk a little bit about what we learned in our last full lesson. In our last lesson, we learned about the Trail of Tears. On our map here, the Trail of Tears is this dotted line that goes from Georgia to modern day Oklahoma, but what was known then as Indian Territory. Remember, the Cherokee people that lived in Georgia were forced out of their homes and had to travel to the Indian Territory. This was a very sad time in American history. The Trail of Tears was a very difficult journey where many Cherokee people lost their lives. They encountered lots of difficulties, like a really bad snowstorm. I'm going to mark the Trail of Tears in purple on my map. On our map, we have another trail that we've already marked, the Oregon Trail, shown here in red. The Oregon Trail is a route that a lot of pioneers who decided to move west by choice and not by force, like the Cherokee people, took to travel to what was called the Oregon Territory. We'll talk about the Oregon Territory in just a little bit. This journey, we talked about it a little bit. We talked about the Morgan family traveling on the Oregon Trail. Was that an easy journey for them? No, they faced a lot of difficulties. Today we'll learn about another family that traveled from Missouri to the Oregon Territory on the Oregon Trail and some of the difficulties that they faced. First, we need to go over our vocabulary words though. Hardships. Hardships are difficult conditions or situations that make someone uncomfortable or cause harm. The Pilgrims endured many hardships as they traveled on the Mayflower. Scout. A scout is a person sent ahead of a traveling group to gather information about what lies ahead. The scout rode ahead of Lewis and Clark to search for a way down the mountain. Ruts. Ruts are grooves worn into soft ground. After the heavy rain, the wheels of the truck caused deep ruts in the mud. Steep. If something is steep, that means that it has a very sharp slope. Brian spent months preparing for his steep climb up the Andes Mountains in Peru. A territory is a region or area of land. It can also be an area of land that belongs to a country's government, but isn't yet a state or province. The land in the Louisiana Territory became the states of Colorado, Arkansas, and Montana, to name just a few. We learned when we talked about the Morgan family about how they were moving to the Oregon Territory. At this time, Oregon wasn't a state yet like it is today. It was a territory. It was part of our government, but it wasn't a state yet. It was a territory. The wagon train was moving westward along the Oregon Trail. The families walked beside or rode in large covered wagons pulled by oxen. Each family had only one wagon, but that wagon was able to hold almost everything the family owned. What kinds of things do you think the families took with them? Think about what the Morgans took in our first story. Each family packed food, things like flour, potatoes, and beans. They took clothes, blankets, soap, candles, furniture, pots and pans, china, and rifles. They even had to take barrels of water with them because they weren't sure where they might find clean water along the way. By the time everything was packed in the wagon, there wasn't a whole lot of room for much else. That's why most families walked alongside their covered wagons. In addition to the oxen that pulled the wagons, some families brought other animals, such as horses, sheep, and cows. These animals didn't go inside the covered wagons. Instead, they were tied to the wagons with rope and walked behind or beside the wagons. Many of these families were headed to the Oregon Territory, where they planned to settle and make new homes. Back in the East, it had become too expensive for the settlers to be able to own their own land. They hoped that by traveling west, they might find a place to build their own homes. Others chose to go for the adventure of starting a new life. What do you think? Would you be excited to start such an adventure? Do you think you might be a little bit nervous too? The road west had been challenging already. The wagon train had been traveling for 3 long months. The settlers were following a rough or uneven trail of wagon ruts to the Oregon Territory. After many wagons followed one path, the ruts became so deep that it was very difficult, or even impossible, for wagons to travel without getting stuck. As much of the Oregon Trail went through what was known as Indian Territory, the travelers encountered Native American tribes along the way. Sometimes the Native Americans were fearful that the settlers would decide to stop traveling and just make farms right there on their lands. On this particular day, the wagon train moved slowly in 100-degree heat. Thomas Lawrence, a settler and the wagon train scout, rode quickly over to the leader of the wagon train, Captain Jeremiah Ward, to report on the trail ahead. "There's water half a mile ahead, but it's not fit for drinking," Mr. Lawrence reported. "We ought to reach Sweetwater River by noon, though, and that water is safe." Captain Ward nodded his head. "Good work, Thomas." When the wagons reached the Sweetwater River, everyone enjoyed a long, cool drink. Captain Ward ordered, "First we'll take the wagons and the oxen across the river. Then we'll swim the extra horses over. The cattle will go last." To lighten their loads for crossing, families removed any heavy objects from their wagons. The settlers brought many of these items to have in their new homes, to remind them of their homes back in the East. Now many of those items that they'd hoped to have in their new homes had to be left behind. Fortunately, everyone crossed safely. Once everyone was across and settled, they refilled their water barrels and canteens. They would need the fresh water for the next portion of their trip. Then they set up camp for the night. They made small campfires over which they cooked their food, beans and bacon. Less than an hour after darkness fell, when most of the travelers were sleeping in their tents or wagons, the wind began to rise, whooshing across the plains. Thomas Lawrence, who was watching the cattle, could hear rumbling off in the distance. Suddenly, a flash of lightning split the night sky. The next instant, a blinding rain fell on the sleeping pioneers. Then, out of nowhere, the wind blew so hard that half of the tents blew over. Those who had been in tents ran to their wagons, squeezing into any space they could find amid the furniture and supplies. Still, everyone was already soaking wet, and even tying the canvas flaps shut could not keep some of the rain from blowing in. Inside the Lawrence family's wagon, everyone huddled together, shivering. 9-year-old Barbara said, "Folks call these wagons prairie schooners, Mama, as if they were schooner ships sailing the wide open land instead of the sea." I didn't really think that the schooner ships and our prairie schooner were that much alike, but with the wind rocking the wagon back and forth, I feel as if we really are at sea. 6-year-old Abigail whispered, "I wish we were home." At that moment, the canvas flaps opened, and Thomas Lawrence joined his family inside the wagon. Abigail asked, "Papa, why aren't you with the cattle?" He explained, "The first lightning bolt spooked them so much that they ran off. We'll have to round them up after the storm." Do you think the pioneers are going to be able to find their cattle? After a cold, miserable night, The morning dawned cool and gray. Abigail awoke to the sound of a bell. Peering out, she exclaimed, "Why, it's Snowbell!" She found her way back. Sure enough, the Lawrences' milk cow was standing outside the wagon, ready to be milked. Mr. Lawrence told his wife, "Patricia, have one of the boys milk her. I have an idea." Mr. Lawrence trudged, or walked heavily, through the thick mud to Captain Ward's wagon. Captain Ward was already up helping other people. "Our milk cow came home," Mr. Lawrence reported. "If we can follow her tracks, maybe we'll find some of the other animals." Captain Ward agreed, and so on horseback, Thomas Lawrence and some other men followed the cow's tracks back to where she had been. Beyond a grove of trees, they found the missing animals calmly chewing the wet prairie grass, as if nothing had happened. Mr. Lawrence rode back over to his wife near the family wagon and joked, "Well, that was certainly fun." She replied, "Let's hope that we have seen the worst of the Oregon Trail." Do you think that they're going to have any more difficulties on the trail? But 2 months later, the trail presented one last challenge to the pioneers. They were crossing the high mountains of the eastern part of the Oregon Territory on their way to the Green Valley beyond. That day, Captain Jeremiah Ward and Thomas Lawrence stood together and looked down at the steep mountain trail ahead. The captain said, "We'll have to take this steep path down. There's no other way. If we turn back to take the southern trail, we'd lose too much time. Then we'd never make it out of these mountains before the winter snow hits us." Mr. Lawrence agreed. "It is the only way, but it will be difficult. When I scouted ahead," he said, "I found that the forest crowds in too closely for a wagon to travel on either side of the trail. So we must take the trail itself. At least this extremely steep stretch is fairly short, only about 160 feet. Then the trail levels out and is in good condition again. Once we make it down the hill, the trail will be much easier." Fortunately, Captain Ward had a plan. "Tell everyone to unhitch the oxen from the front of the wagons and reconnect them to the back. We'll walk with them on the paths on either side of the trail, and the oxen will be able to hold the weight of each wagon so that it doesn't slide down. After the wagons are down, our families can follow on foot. We'll bring the herds down last." Half an hour later, the first wagon started down the steep trail. 6 oxen, attached to the wagon by ropes or chains, strained to keep the Lawrences' wagon under control on the bumpy, uneven surface. Watching from the top of the hill was Mrs. Lawrence and the children. As they watched the wagon descend, Mrs. Lawrence said, "It will be a miracle if my china doesn't shatter to pieces with all of that bouncing and banging." China is a very delicate type of pottery, often shaped into plates and cups. It's called china because it was first made in ancient China. After what seemed like a lifetime, there came a cry from the bottom of the incline. "We're down, and everything is in one piece." Everyone cheered, and Captain Ward ordered the men to move the rest of the wagons. By the end of the day, everyone had made it down to the bottom. That night, camping beside a clean, flowing stream, Captain Ward announced, "Tomorrow we'll be out of these mountains, and then we're almost home." 10 days later, Captain Ward led his wagon train out of the forest and into a lush, green valley spread out as far as the eye could see. As each wagon emerged from the trees, and each family saw the valley ahead, everyone fell silent. This was the place that the travelers had dreamed about and worked to reach through 6 months of hardships, or difficulties, and laughter, rain, hail, wind, and heat.
All right, my friends. Why did some families decide to pack all of their belongings in covered wagons and move to the Oregon Territory? Why did they decide to do that? You've got it. A lot of them wanted land. Land was really expensive in the East and it was difficult to own. So they wanted to own land where it was cheaper to buy in the West. A lot of them also wanted a new adventure in their life. What was the Oregon Trail? The Oregon Trail was the trail that pioneers used to travel from Missouri all the way up to the Oregon Territory. How did they travel on the Oregon Trail? Did they fly airplanes? Did they drive cars? They traveled in covered wagons, and many of them had to walk alongside the wagons. How long did it take to travel on the Oregon Trail? How long was that journey? About 6 months. I think that's a long time to spend on a journey. Do you think so? Why do you think that families traveled in wagon trains with a scout riding ahead of them rather than by themselves? These people had never been on this trail before, so they didn't know it very well. And the trail could also be very dangerous. So the scout was there to help guide them and to let them know if something dangerous was on its way. Who already lived in the territory or area through which the Oregon Trail passed? Remember, the colonists were not the first people in America. Native Americans had already lived in these areas. How did they feel about the pioneers moving westward and beginning to settle the West? They were nervous or worried and angry that they were losing their land. What difficulties did families face as they traveled on the Oregon Trail? We talked about how it was a dangerous trail, but what was dangerous about it? There are lots of different things. Their wagons could get stuck in ruts. The weather was dangerous. Crossing the river was dangerous. They had to leave behind their possessions. The heat and walking could cause a lot of weariness or lack of strength. And encounters with Native Americans could be dangerous as well. How is the Oregon Trail different from the road and highways that we have today? How is it different? One big difference is that it wasn't paved or made smooth. It was really rough and rocky terrain. Families followed the ruts instead of actual paved roads. There were no rest stops or gas stations, and they had to cross over rivers. When you drive on the highway today, do you have to cross a river in your car? In the water? No. Roads today have bridges over the waters that we can drive over. Back then, they had to push their wagons through the rivers, which could be dangerous. All right, my friends, we are going to add the Oregon Trail onto our timeline. I have a picture of a covered wagon to represent the Oregon Trail. People traveled on the Oregon Trail largely between the 1840s and the 1850s. We last learned about the Trail of Tears, which happened in 1838. So if we started using the Oregon Trail mainly in the 40s and the 50s, it would go after the Trail of Tears on our timeline. I'm going to put this one up above right here. I'm going to say that this happened from the 1840s to the 1850s. Alright, my friends, there is no physical assignment that you have to do today, no worksheet for you to fill out, but I do have an assignment for you. I want you to think about the story that we read today, and I want you to act it out or retell it to a family member or friend, so whoever is there helping you. Tell them what happened in our story today, and if you'd like to, act it out for them too. When you are done with that, you are all done with knowledge today, and I will see you next time.